My name is John, and today we are diving into the complex reality of American federal governance, where the legacy of the Biden era continues to collide with the persistent influence of former President Donald Trump, creating a divided political system that feels less like a democracy in dialogue and more like two competing governments operating inside the same nation as the United States. Enters the end of 2025. The federal government is not simply debating policy, it is wrestling with its own identity, because while President Biden and his administration remain responsible for federal agencies, executive orders, and diplomatic commitments, former President Trump continues to dominate Republican political strategy, shaping narratives, mobilizing voters, and influencing legislative agendas in Congress without holding any official office. This unusual dynamic has left Washington in a state of permanent confrontation with Republicans in the House aggressively blocking executive priorities. Democrats defending regulatory authority, and the nation watching as every major decision becomes a battleground over the future of American governance. The Biden administration has spent much of the year focused on stabilizing federal agencies, strengthening regulatory frameworks, restoring international alliances, and protecting what it sees as democratic norms. Yet every attempt at progress is met with fierce resistance from a Republican Party that no longer operates independently of Trump's personal political brand, because Trump remains the central figure in conservative media fundraising and primary challenges, meaning that lawmakers who defy his influence often face the threat of being politically replaced. And this reality has transformed congressional debate into something closer to ideological warfare than legislative compromise. Hearings in the House and Senate have increasingly become arenas for political performance, rather than oversight, as committees summon cabinet officials, federal regulators, and intelligence leaders, not only to examine policy failures, but to publicly discredit the legitimacy of the Biden administration itself. Republicans accuse the executive branch of weaponizing federal agencies, especially the Department of Justice and the FBI, while Democrats argue that these investigations are designed to undermine institutions that hold political figures accountable. Meanwhile, Trump uses rallies, social media statements, and televised interviews to position himself as the true leader of the opposition, framing every policy move from Washington as either a betrayal of American values or proof that the system is broken under Democratic control. This constant tension has reshaped federal governance, because agencies that traditionally operated in relative obscurity, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Homeland Security, and even the Centers for Disease Control, now find themselves at the center of political controversy, with their funding questioned, their leaders subpoenaed, and their mandates challenged in court. Congressional hearings that once focused on technical oversight have become emotional spectacles, where lawmakers accuse federal officials of censorship, corruption, or incompetence, and the result is a government that spends more time defending itself than serving the public. This has been especially visible in the fight over federal spending, where every budget negotiation becomes a high-stakes standoff. Republicans aligned with Trump push for sharp spending cuts to social programs, foreign aid, and regulatory agencies, while Democrats argue that such cuts would cripple essential services and deepen inequality. The Biden administration attempts to pass funding bills that protect infrastructure investment, climate programs, healthcare expansion, and public education, yet these proposals face resistance not just over their content, but over the identity of the administration proposing them. Because for many Republicans, opposing Biden is not about fiscal responsibility, it is about political loyalty to Trump, and this loyalty extends into national security debates, where congressional committees investigate military leadership, intelligence operations, and international agreements, with the clear goal of questioning the competence of current leadership. Trump allies argue that America has become weak on the world stage, that allies no longer respect Washington, and that federal agencies are distracted by political correctness rather than national defense, while Democrats counter that Trump's rhetoric threatens alliances and undermines the credibility of U.S. institutions abroad. These disagreements are no longer contained within committee rooms. They spill onto television screens and social media feeds, shaping how Americans perceive their own government. The idea of bipartisan cooperation, which once defined the U.S. Congress now feels like a relic, as hearings are often scheduled not to solve problems, but to generate headlines and social media clips with lawmakers speaking more to their political base than to each other. And at the center of it all remains Donald Trump, whose presence looms over every policy debate. Even though he does not sign bills, appoint judges, or command federal agencies, his influence is felt in every vote where Republicans fear his endorsement or condemnation. And this has created a unique political environment where the executive branch, governed by Biden, must contend not only with opposition from Congress, but with a parallel narrative driven by a former president who presents himself as the alternative authority to the sitting government. This duality is most evident in the way congressional investigations are framed. When Democrats launch inquiries into election interference, misinformation, or extremist threats, Republicans respond with investigations into the origins of federal prosecutions, the handling of classified documents, or alleged bias within federal law enforcement, turning oversight into a cycle of retaliation that leaves the public confused about who is accountable for what and why. Meanwhile, policy stagnation becomes the norm, because when both sides treat governance as warfare, compromise becomes political suicide, and so federal agencies wait for budgets that are delayed, executive orders face court challenges, and international partners question the reliability of American commitments. This political climate has real consequences for ordinary citizens, because while Washington fights over ideology, inflation, housing affordability, healthcare costs, and student debt remain unresolved. Yet these issues are repeatedly pushed aside as hearings focus on subpoenas, scandals, and loyalty tests rather than solutions. Trump continues to position himself as the champion of the forgotten American, promising to dismantle what he calls the corrupt federal establishment, while Biden frames his administration as the last line of defense for democratic stability. And this clash of narratives has polarized the nation to the point where trust in federal institutions has dropped to historic lows. Polls show that many Americans no longer believe Congress represents them, and that the presidency has become too powerful or too weak, depending on political affiliation. This erosion of trust is perhaps the most dangerous legacy of the current era. Because when citizens stop believing in the legitimacy of their government, the foundations of democracy begin to crack, and yet neither side appears willing to change course. Democrats argue that protecting institutions requires standing firm against Trumpism, while Republicans insist that dismantling what they see as a bloated federal state is the only path forward, and trapped between these two visions is a government that struggles to function as intended. As we move toward another election cycle, the stakes continue to rise because every hearing, every spending bill, every foreign policy decision is viewed not as governance, but as a campaign maneuver, with Trump's shadow looming over every Republican strategy, and Biden's administration fighting to preserve authority in a political landscape that increasingly rejects compromise. This is not simply a debate over policies, it is a struggle over who gets to define America's future, whether it will be shaped by the restoration of traditional federal leadership, or by a movement that seeks to radically transform the system from within. And until that question is answered, the United States will remain locked in a cycle of division, where governing feels less like service and more like survival.